I asked Joe to share with me a little reflection on his career, and this is what he wrote to me. He said, "My life as a journalist has been rewarding and educational. From talking to people on their cell phones as they were trapped in the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center on 9/11 in 2001, to writing about the homeless, drug addicts, and the common man, I've learned a lot. But the lesson that keeps returning again and again is humility. Just when you start to puff your chest, someone inevitably comes along and punches you in the stomach." Joe, thank you and Stan Farrior for joining us tonight. Dr. Farrior will speak to us later in the program, and I want to turn the program over to Joe. Joe?
Thank you, Mike. That was a very flattering introduction. All of that is kind of true. It is true. I've had some very, very interesting experiences with editors. Editors are sort of like Klingons, you know, they've paid their duty, and, you know, they just sit at their desk, eat potato chips or Doritos and drink coffee all day. And, you know, they just have, they turn mean and ornery at some point, but they're really, you know, embodiments of wisdom. So I want to thank everybody here for coming here. And I want to point out that, you know, you are a special breed of people, and you should really take pride in that, because we live in a day and an age when, you know, everything is about Twitter and Instagram and text messaging, and people are always talking about ADD and ADHD, and nobody really has any long attention spans. If they want to do something over a long period of time, they sit down in front of Netflix and binge watch maybe a mini series or something like that. But not too many people, you won't hear too many people saying, I'm going to curl up with a book and really enjoy the next few hours, because it requires a lot of concentration, it requires a lot of mental energy. And I think that the mere fact that you are patrons of the library, which is a place of books, is really very, very edifying to me. It's very, it gives me a lot of hope to continue writing books, because otherwise, why would I be writing books or trying to write books? Anyway, so it's my way of thanking you for participating in this discussion. I also want to thank Mike and Alan for doing what they did, because if this was a year ago, we would all be kind of crowding into a small room, well heated this time of year, and turning our gaze to a wall where there is a white screen that drops down from the ceiling. And thanks to technology that has been around for about 20 years or so, we'll all watch images being projected onto it with the intelligence of Panasonic and Epson and Hitachi and some of these other overhead projection manufacturers. But now we're scrambling. I know Mike and Alan have been doing this over the last few days. Alan and I spent a couple of hours yesterday familiarizing ourselves with bandwidths and upload speeds and words like latency, which I guess is a computer freeze. And so anyway, they had to do all of this technological preparation in order to put this on and keep the life of the library going in these times, these difficult times of pandemics and COVID-19. So I want to thank them also. And I want to thank Stan, who is here because he is the reason that he's a major reason that the book got out, and I'll explain to you later on in a few minutes how Stan features very, very largely in this project. And I'm Joe Pereira. The book says Joseph Pereira, and I want to make sure that you understand that that's my mother's doing, because my mother said, you can't write a book with just Joe Pereira. You got to have your byline, your name as Joseph Pereira. She said, you don't see books by Steve King, you know, and you see Stephen King. I said, yeah, but Mom, you know, Stephen King is one of those rare people where you could reverse his name, King Stephen, and still everybody would know who he is because he is king of the, you know, the best-selling list today. And my mom said, no, you have to be Joseph. So anyway, we'll stick with Joseph. So I want to tell you a little bit about how this book came about, and give you a few tips on how to write a book if you have such plans. And then I'll give you a little, I'll set the theme a little bit about, you know, the World War II background in which this book takes place, the action in this book takes place. And I'll turn it over to Stan, and after he tells you his very, very interesting story and his detective work, he is one heck of a Sherlock Holmes, I'll tell you that. And after that, we'll circle back to me, and I'll try to give you a few more details about the book, depending upon your tolerance for detail and interest level, and then we'll open it up for questions. It's going to be a very, very informal format. You know, I will be thinking out loud as I speak to you. I haven't really memorized any scripts, so I just want to make sure that I kind of speak in a linear fashion, and I'll try to watch some of your expressions and see whether or not you are with me, or I should change the subject. But there are lots of different aspects of this book that I think you know, would really be part of tonight's discussion. Mostly I want to tell you some stories. I'll start off with a story about the co-author, Jack Wilson, and then I'll tell you a story about me. And you'll see that these stories will have some kind of thread that runs through them, that will tie them all together. So the story about my co-author, Jack Wilson, is part of it is in the book. One day on June 10th, 2009, one morning in that springtime, he got up from wherever he was, went to his desk, and he was trying to catch up on the news. He looked at how his stocks were doing on the stock market, and he looked at his sports teams. At that time, the New York Yankees were playing the Boston Red Sox, the two big rivalries up north. And then he happened to come across a photo of a tattered pair of boots. And he looked at the boots with a special curiosity. He had seen lots and lots of artifacts of World War II before, but this particular photo really captured his attention. He couldn't really put his finger on it. He didn't really understand why, but he had some things to do. So he went off, turned off his computer, went away, and came back about an hour later. And he tried to log on to the website of the Boston Globe, where he found this picture, and he couldn't find it. In its place was another picture, and he toggled back and forth. He went through a few pages, couldn't find it. So he gave it a couple of hours in the morning. He came back around lunchtime, and he looked for that picture again, couldn't find it. And he kept coming back through the rest of the day, looking for the photo of those tattered boots. They just looked very dilapidated. There was mud on them, and it was certainly not fit for wear at all. But for some reason or other, he really wanted to find out more about those boots. So a few days later, when he had some time, he decided to call the Boston Globe, call their library, and ask them if he could come down and look through their archives, the online archives, for the photo, because he really wanted to get a copy of it. The library very generously told him, yes, come on down, we'll help you. So he went down to the Boston Globe's library, and he rummaged through all of their online pictures for the week, couldn't find it. And he was really frustrated. Alan, you want to flash on the picture of these boots? Yeah, that's what it looks like. You know, certainly not wearable. The shoelaces are missing. It certainly has been through hell and probably a lot of combat action. And so Jack went away from the Globe, determined to find out two things: whose boots those were and why they were back tattered like that. And so that was his determination. So let me stop the story there and let me tell you a story about me. Go back 3 decades, more than 3 decades, to a time when I was not in this country. I wasn't born in this country. And I was in a place in the Far East in a country called Burma. Today it's called Myanmar. And I was a young lad in a boarding school. And at 4 o'clock in the morning, one of the priests who was part of the staff there came and woke me up. And he said, "Pack your bags. I have to take you downstairs." Dormitory was on the 2nd floor. So I packed my bags. I had a small little suitcase and threw all my clothes in there. And I hurried downstairs to following him. He took me to the headmaster's office. And in the office there were my parents, my father and my mother. And they said, "Joe, we have to get out of here in a hurry." I didn't really know why, but I didn't ask any questions. I said goodbye to the staff and to the headmaster and left with them. We got on a train, traveled for about 10 hours. We went right to the airport in Rangoon. We got on a small propeller plane and took off in a hurry. From there, we went to Bangkok, which was the next country over. And we stayed there a couple of weeks. My parents were making mad phone calls to a lot of people. And from there, we went to Hong Kong. And in Hong Kong, they did the same thing, making a lot of frantic phone calls. And from Hong Kong, we got on one of those President liners, the President Wilson. It's one of those big cargo ships and passenger ships. It was a combination of cargo and passenger ships. And we headed to San Francisco. And in San Francisco, we didn't waste much time. We got a hold of an immigration lawyer and went right to an immigration court, stood in front of an immigration judge, and the judge looked at our papers. He talked to the attorney, and he turned to us and said, "You know, I'm sorry, you do have passports. You have a British passport. You have a country you can go to, even though you're running away from a dangerous situation. We can't give you asylum. I'm sorry, you're going to have to leave." So we were very, very dejected by the news, and we slowly made our way out of the courtroom. And just as we got to the door, the judge said, "Wait a second." For some reason or other, he was prompted to say what he was about to say. He said, "Young man," to me, he says, "Why are you dressed like that?" I was dressed in a blue blazer, white shirt, and khaki pants and black shoes. And so I turned to him and I said, "Your Honor, I am dressed this way to pay you the full respects you deserve. This is the way I have been brought up, to respect my elders and to show that respect by dressing properly." The judge was quite moved by my answer. So he said to me, "You know, you are in school, correct?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "You know, I can keep you in this country on a student visa. Would you like that?" I didn't want to stay in a country I'd never been to. I knew nobody here, but my mom thought that, you know, if I was in this country as a student, maybe she could move up the immigration quota list and be allowed to immigrate to this country sooner than she would have been. And so she said to the judge, "Oh yeah, he wants to stay here." So, you know, they left. They got on a plane and left for Latin America. I didn't even know which country they were headed to. So I was in the United States all by myself at the age of 13, with no friends and nobody to turn to if I needed help. And I was in that sort of situation for about 3 or 4 years, going through high school, not knowing where my parents were. And one emotion that I really couldn't come to terms with was fear. I was really a coward. I was scared of everything, and I was looking at literature. That was my only sort of crutch at that time, trying to find out how to be brave. And among the books that I read, I came across Stephen Crane's Red Badge of Courage. And I read the book several times, because Red Badge of Courage, as you know, is about courage, is about finding courage. It's about trying to be brave and learning how to be brave in a difficult situation. So, I set aside here a couple of paragraphs that I'll read to you that really spoke to me at the time. When I was about 16 or 17 at the time. And this was from a section of the book early on in the book, where Henry Fleming, the main character, is confronted for the first time with the enemy. He is facing a daunting and formidable force, and he is shaking in his boots. And this is what Stephen Crane writes. To the youth, which is Henry Fleming, it was an onslaught of redoubtable dragons. He became like the man who lost his legs at the approach of the red and green monster. He waited in a sort of horrified, listening attitude. He seemed to shut his eyes and wait to be gobbled. So that was a description of how he felt at the time. And, of course, if you read, I won't read the other paragraphs, but he flees to the back of the camp with the rest of his buddies, his comrades. And that's in the beginning of the story, when he is confronted with his own fears. But later on in the book, a few hundred pages later, I came across this paragraph, and he is a different person at that point. He, meaning Henry Fleming, fixed his eye upon a distant and prominent clump of trees where he had concluded the enemy were to be met, and he ran toward it as toward a goal. His eyes were fixed in a lurid glare, and with his soiled and disordered dress, his red and inflamed features surmounted by the dingy rag with its spot of blood, his wildly swinging rifle and banging accoutrements, he looked to be an insane soldier. So my question was, how did he go from redoubtable dragons to being an insane soldier? And I wanted to know that, because it would help me as a human being to be brave in a moment when I felt that, I was surrounded by enemies. And so I wrote a term paper, but in the term paper, I can't remember exactly what I wrote, but in the term paper, I remember not being able to resolve that issue. And so I'm going to stop that story there, okay? So you've got the two stories of the boot appearing on the computer screen and me fleeing to a country where I felt really very, very isolated and scared. And so, in 2009, Jack sees this boot, right? He waits for a couple of years. He does a lot of research and into the boot. And around 2011, 2012, he decides he wants to write a book based on what he's found out. And so he writes a book proposal. He gets an agent. He tries to shop the book around. No interest. He tries to shop the book around again. No interest. And so after a couple of years, in about 2016, 2017, they come to me, they give me a call. They say, would you be interested in taking on a project? And I said, well, let's have coffee. I'll see what you have, and we'll take it from there. So Jack and I sit down to a cup of coffee, and it's a long session. It's about 2 hours or so. And Jack tells me what his designs for the book is, what his plans for the book is. And I listen to him, and I'm not all that taken by his approach to the book. I don't really think it's going to work, and the proof is that he's gotten a lot of rejections. So, but at the same time, there seemed to be a kernel of something there that that existed. His was basically, he wanted to take the story of this paranormal experience that he had, this sort of preternatural experience that he had of this pair of boots in a photo appearing on a computer screen, communicating with him in some strange, unexplainable way. He wanted to take that as a sort of a teaser into writing a book about that would goad the US Army into getting more aggressive about looking for MIAs, particularly from World War II, and very, very specifically in Europe, where those boots came from. Those boots were from Germany. And, but, you know, and so I do include, those of you who have read the book or you will be reading the book, you'll notice a couple of paragraphs. Let me read a couple of paragraphs from the book and from that section, and I'll know, and you'll know what I mean. In the growing anthology of war stories, a handful of similar experiences have been told by otherwise quite rational folk. Pat Scannon, a physician and CEO of a biotech company in California, was wading in waist-deep water one afternoon off the beaches of Coral Island in the Pacific Ocean when suddenly he felt a chill wash over his body, as if the temperature of the water had plunged to nearly freezing. The sensation began in the lower part of his legs and moved all the way up to his scalp, making him feel as though his hair was standing at attention. The inexplicable experience set Scannon off on a self-funded multi-million-dollar expedition that resulted in the discovery of a B-24 Liberator, a World War II bomber carrying 14 US airmen. So that was quite an experience that was strong enough for him to get on this multi-million-dollar expedition. And there was also another person, once again, in this genre of World War II, of communicating with, you know, the other side of, you know, of our existence. And this was a Ruth Lynn. On the night of November 4, 1944, Ruth Lynn, mother of two small children, was awakened from her sleep by the sound of someone whistling on her front porch. It sounded very much like her husband, who was away at war in Europe. As the story is told in a memoir written by her granddaughter's husband, she jumped out of bed and hurried to the front door, but there was no one there. The porch was empty and the road in front of their little house dark and deserted. Until the day she died, Lynn believed that that was her husband. Not long after that, she received news that he had been killed in battle. Ruth's husband also happened to be a soldier in the All Souls Day battle, but that's just coincidence. So, you know, there was this Jack Wilson story of this boot reaching out from the computer screen, from the beyond to him, that I thought was good, but I needed to get a little bit more than that in order to be able to interest a publisher. And so how do I said yes, you know, I said yes, because I was interested in trying to come to terms with my demons of trying to find the answer to being brave. And at the same time, there was this other element of, you know, unexplainable events. But how do I take a book from being non-publishable to being publishable? And this is where I see that you know, it's been about a half an hour, so I don't want to drag this on. I want to have Stan pitch in here and talk really quickly. So I'll give you a very, very abbreviated version of how I went from a book that I thought would have no legs to a book that eventually got accepted by a publisher. And, you know, one thing that helped me was my background in journalism. As I was coming through, as I entered this career, you know, a lot of journalism is learned right there on the job. It's very difficult to simulate these situations in college. And so you just have to get yourself right smack in the middle of a breaking news story and try your best to tell the story in as an engaging a way as you can. And I needed a lot of help. And so there was this one old crotchety editor. His name was Ed, that I happened to like. And I'm not sure if he liked me or not, but he fancied himself as a sort of a mentor, and he really liked to bring young reporters along. And so a lot of times when I had a half-baked idea, I would go to him and try to either hone it to a publishable shape or just throw it away. And so, you know, the only problem is that I couldn't call him. He had passed. He had died a few years before. And so what I did was I had spent enough time with him in the newsroom to know how he would answer a lot of my questions. And so I imagined him coming back to life, or me crossing over the Allegiant Fields to where he was. And I started an imaginary conversation with him. And the conversation went something like this, you know, Ed, I'm here, I need your help. You know, I want to write a book. Oh yeah, what do you want to write about? Well, it's about MIAs, soldiers missing in action. And so he says to me, you know, well, Joe, you know, that's a hard story to write, because how many soldiers are there that MIAs from World War II? Well, there are about 70,000 soldiers missing from World War II. Well, you know, how is your story going to be different than one of the other 70,000? What makes your story so special? Well, Ed, my story is about brave guys. I did a little bit of digging around, and you know, I have this problem with bravery, and these soldiers are really brave. Yeah, but you know, Joe, a lot of MIAs are brave. If you read soldier stories, they're usually about bravery and about daring do. You know, so why is your story any different? Well, Ed, let me think. You know, the bravery of these soldiers came at a very, very special time in the history of World War II, when something very unusual happened. And what was that? Well, you know, you're really old, Ed, and you're from the old times. You would be familiar with this. From the time of the Civil War to the present day, there has been only one American who has been taken before a firing squad and shot to death. And that American, his name is Eddie Slovic. Yeah, thanks. So that is Eddie Slovic. And that American was shot because of crime. And that crime was being a coward. So he was shot for being a coward. And he is the only, it is so cruel a punishment that he is the only one since the Civil War to have ever been subjected to this type of punishment. And Eddie was a member of the 28th Infantry Division. And my guys in this book that I want to write happened to be in the 28th Infantry Division, and they happened to be fighting in the front line from which Eddie Slovic was running away. And so this gives my guys a little bit more of a special consideration. What do you think, Ed? Do you think that that would still be a story? And so Ed said, well, you know, all right, so there is a little bit of interest. You've gotten a little bit of my interest. What else do you have? I said, well, you know, these soldiers who put themselves in the front line had to pay a price. And that price was paid not just by them, but also by their families. And what price was that? Well, their families, you know, had some very, very special circumstances that that would stand out in any miniseries or even a book in and of themselves. And so Ed says, well, tell me about them. And I said, well, one of the fathers of these soldiers that went to the front line, he was sitting on a gold mine. He owned this piece of property, and this property was sitting right on a very, very big lake that was used for recreational purposes. And he could turn that into a resort, especially when America was coming into some money after the Second World War. But he never really started that business. He was waiting for his son to come back from battle, from the war, the Second World War. And he waited and waited. He waited for over 2 decades. He waited for over 20 years. And he died still waiting for his son. And everybody around him, family members, were telling him, that he was wasting away a golden opportunity. But he waited for his son to come back from war, even though 22 years had passed. And another family was in a sort of a similar situation. They were in New Jersey, and they had some very large acreage of land, farming land, and the land was very valuable. And they set aside a couple of acres for, once again, a son who went off to war, went off to battle, and didn't come back. And they, a lot of real estate developers came to them asking them if they wanted to sell the land because it was a very, very strategically placed, and they refused to sell that land. And that land, to this very day, is unsold because that family is waiting for their soldier who went away in 1944 to come back. And when he comes back, they want to make sure that he has some land to farm, and he will be able to, make a living off of it, or at least grow some food off of it. And these are real stories. You think that this was fiction, but this is a real story. So Ed says, all right, okay, all right. It seems like you have the makings of, something. So just go ahead and propose the story. So I sit down, write a proposal, send it to the University of Nebraska Press. They say, yes, fine, okay. When can you give it to me? We'd like to have it in 4 months. I can't have it in 4 months because I haven't really done much work on this. I said, well, how about 6 months? So this was the week before Thanksgiving in 2018. They said, we want the manuscript by Memorial Day 2019. It gave me about 6 months. And I was frantic. I worked 16-hour days, and during this whole time, I had to get enough material, enough detail to be able to fill 75,000 words. A regular story, a regular magazine story is about 1,000 words. So I was really panicking at this point, also trying my hardest to get as much information as I could to write about, to write this book. And I looked at a whole bunch of documents. You go to the National Archives, which is a government library in College Park. College Park, Maryland, you get lots of documents, a lot of battlefield reports that you can really sink your teeth in and spend weeks there just reading over the reports of generals and sergeants that were fighting in battles back then. And you can also get some dossiers on these soldiers from another National Archives office in St. Louis. And so those are the 2 places that I looked at. But there was still something missing. I needed to tell the story. I needed to create a narrative from the training camps in the United States and take the reader all the way to the battlefield in Germany, where this particular battle, All Souls Day battle, was fought. And I needed to get someone with intelligence and with a lot of information to tell me what happened. And I made a whole bunch of phone calls, and lo and behold, one day I called a 909 area code number, and I got on the other line a guy by the name of Stan Farrior. And Stan Farrior had a brother, and that was my gold mine. That was my jackpot. Stan Farrior had a brother who had a master's degree, I think in forest science, agriculture and forestry science. And he was a really very smart guy. Not only that, he was also a high-ranking officer in his unit, which made a huge difference, because if some of you may be familiar with letters that soldiers wrote from the front line back to their families, and those letters are very mundane stuff, and they had to keep it very vague and about family matters, only because they didn't want to give away any military secrets. Those letters were heavily censored by the top brass. But because of the fact that Julian Farrior, Stanley's older brother, was a high-ranking member, they didn't censor his letters as closely. And as a result of that, there was lots and lots of information that I was able to get from Stanley's older brother's letters. And that really helped me put together a story that got my publisher and the editors at the publishers interested. And I was only able to write a first draft, like I was telling Mike, and believe it or not, I didn't have to write a second one. They liked what they saw, and it was all because I think that Stanley was there, and he put me in touch with Julian's letters. He is a great collector, and with that note, I'm going to give you Stanley and let him tell you his story. He has a tremendous story, which required a lot of digging, a lot of internet research, and a lot of shoe leather work as well. And one day he just got on the phone and he made some frantic phone calls, and he'll tell you that story.
Good job, Joe. I appreciate those nice remarks. And it's great to be with all of you out there tonight. And I really appreciate all of your interest in my good friend Joseph Pereira's book, All Souls Day. I'm Stanley M. Farrior, and my brother Julian Wade Farrior is one of the featured characters in the book, like Joe was explaining to you. I had 3 brothers and 1 sister who were in the military in World War II. One brother, Julian Wade Farrior, was killed in Germany on November the 9th, 1944, a cold, dreary night. And one brother was wounded, and that was Alan. And the other 2, one brother and 1 sister, made it through unhurt. And I remember my dad, after my 3 brothers left, went off to war, my father said, well, Rachel wanted to go. And she was unusual for a girl back 75 years ago willing to go to war. But she was I don't know exactly how to say it, patriotic. And she told Dad, my 3 brothers are over there and I want to go. So when they all left, my mother said that she knew they would not all return. And unfortunately, she was right. She said there were too many in the family going, they probably wouldn't all return. I was 8 years old at that time when Julian was killed. First, I have a letter here that it was the last letter that my brother Julian wrote to my brother Edward. And it was dated November the 1st. And I've come across 3 letters dated that date. And it's kind of interesting because they were in 3 parts of the world, really. And one was to Edward, and one was to Grace, Julian's wife, and the other one was to my mother and dad. And it's funny how you really got it like it really was for the one that he wrote to Edward. And then it was hold back a little bit with Grace. And then the one he wrote to my mother and dad, it was like, you know, nothing's wrong over here, really. So I guess that's kind of a natural scheme of things. Okay, I'm gonna start reading this last letter to Edward. By the way, Edward was my oldest brother, and he was about 4 years older than Julian. Dear Edward, I appreciate your long letter telling all about yourself and home so very, very much. If you have a job that will keep you back in the States and like it, I certainly wouldn't worry about the monotony of it all. Edward was in the Army too, but he was in supply work. He was lucky enough not to have to go overseas. I wouldn't let the lack of advancement worry me at all. This business of combat is hell, and I sincerely hope that neither you nor Alan has to face it. As it turned out, Alan went to the South Pacific and Julian was in Europe, and Alan was close to combat. I'm not feeling sorry for myself when I say that, because I have as much guts under fire as anybody else. But let no one ever kid you. Any sane man is scared under fire, and one never gets used to fighting. It gets progressively harder and harder to go into battle. Don't ever let anyone ever romanticize combat to you. Only those who actually have seen it will ever have the least conception of it. This was written, I think I said, on November 1. He was killed on November 9. And I think this sentence he has of it gets progressively harder and harder to go into battle. To me, that kind of indicates that he saw the end coming. He had been through and survived unbelievable amount of combat for 3.5 months prior to that. It cannot be properly described or pictured. I have lived underground for 3 months, and the ground has certainly saved my life many times. I have seen enemy artillery drive men absolutely crazy, and I was awfully shaky too for the lack of sleep and also concussion from big shells. Many times I've lain flat in the bottom of my foxhole, wondering if the next artillery shell was coming in on top of me. Can you imagine that? At night in rain, and you're lying there alone, not knowing when your head was going to be blown off. I just can't, I don't know how anybody ever comes out of that. All day shells landed just short and just over my foxhole and had covered me with dirt. I was shaking like a leaf and praying to God that I be spared. It certainly is a helpless feeling to hear the 500 and 1,000 pounders whistle through the air and not know where they were going to land. I'm sorry that I have taken up so much of this letter with battle experiences, but the above is just part of a day's work up here in the front lines. Julian would say that every now and then. You know, he's over there, could have gotten killed 100 times in one day, and he's saying, I'm sorry, older brother, who's sitting there smoking a cigar in North Carolina, that I bored you with what's happening over here. I don't know. I just, Julian was just so special that I can't say enough about him. My boys and I assaulted a German position in an orchard in France, and I was slightly wounded in the foot. I have exchanged as many as 25 bullets with a German soldier before felling him, and his bullets were pecking all around me. Several times I have been surrounded, and somehow we shot our way out. Determined American fire will stop any gang of Germans. Our weapons fire slower, but they hit harder, and that's what counts. We Americans are just too kind-hearted for our own good, and it doesn't take us long to forget. However, if anyone could see some of the sights I have seen, they couldn't forget the crimes of our enemy. It's awfully hard to see good American boys suddenly disintegrate beside you, or see medics shot down when their identification was clear, so clear that even a blind enemy rifleman couldn't have made such a mistake. And to me, this next line shows what kind of a man he was. I have never failed to give a wounded German the same first aid that I would my own men after I had just shot him down. That is awfully hard to do when just a few minutes before he was exchanging shots with me and I was lucky enough to get the first hit. A lot of times it's awfully tempting to put a second shot or a bayonet through an enemy soldier who is dropped, but somehow one feels like that is the same as hitting a man that is down. Even in warfare, it's hard not to be ethical. Don't get too optimistic, Edward, about this war. Plenty of fighting action lies ahead. Very sincerely, Julian. Okay, that was written November the 1st, and the war was over, I believe, in May of the next year. So we had about 6 more months of fighting. Next, I'd like to say a little bit about my father's reaction to Julian's death. One morning in February 1944, my father drove his car down to open his clothing and dry goods store in Burgaw, North Carolina. He noticed a man whom everyone in town dreaded to see. This man delivered telegrams around town, and often it would be from the War Department with the news that a soldier from that family had been killed. The man walked right up behind my father with a telegram in his hand, and he said, "Mr. Farrior." That's all he needed to say. My father immediately turned around and exclaimed, "Oh my God, Julian is dead." Having just lost my mother to a stroke only a few weeks prior, his grief was overwhelming. Excuse me. Now for a little about my reaction to Julian's death. I learned of my brother's death after I got home later that day. I handled this terrible news about Julian as totally rejecting it as the truth. During that time, I was convinced myself that the Army had made a mistake and that Julian would come walking through that door at any time and be home again. As an 8-year-old boy, I did not grieve for many, many years. The parenting norm in those days regarding matters related to death and dying was the less said, the better. So I continued to live my life as usual. As a teenager, I became occupied with typical adolescent issues: friends, girls, sports, and what I wanted to be when I grew up. In time, I graduated from high school, attended college, and received a degree in industrial engineering from North Carolina State. I dated, met my future wife, got married, changed careers, went to dental school, became a dentist, and raised a family. All that took a lot of years. Okay, and finally, this probably will be a little unbelievable to some of you, but at age 70, in 2006, I realized that I had not fully accepted Julian's death, nor had I mourned over the loss. All that changed suddenly, and I was driven to find out all that I could about his life and military experience and his death. I got the idea that I wanted to do extensive research about Julian and write it all down and share it with friends and relatives and anyone who might be interested. Contrary to all of the other children in my family who lived to grow up, Julian did not have the opportunity to have a natural length of life. And I wanted family and friends to know what a great person he really was. I am so pleased that Joseph Pereira came along and aided me greatly in that objective. Thank you, Joe. And one thing my dad said that, well, I believed a lot of what my dad said, but wow, I slipped my mind. Let me think of it. Oh, he said that Julian was the cream of the crop of our family. And I always tell people we had a big crop. My mother had 13 children. And I never thought bad of my daddy. I never disagreed with him. I think he's right. Smart as he could be, handsome as he could be, perfect build, good man, good brother. Could really have done anything that he wanted to do. Okay. I want to say a little bit about, in my interest I thought some about writing a book, but then life sort of interfered and my wife died and time went by, and then along came Joe, and I got this opportunity to have some things said about my brother, and we worked together, and it was really great, and I really do think a lot of him, of you. But there are several things that he asked me, well, how did you find out this, that, and the other? And one was the discovery of a man named James Condon. I looked in, I bought a half dozen books about the fight over there in the Hurkin Forest, and 2 or 3 of them mentioned my brother Julian, and so that made me just buy every one I can get my hands on, see if I could find his name again. But in one of them, the books, it was described the names of some of the soldiers, and this guy James A. Condon, was an officer in the company next to Julian's company, same battalion. And so I thought, well, more than likely James Condon would have known Julian. So I'm gonna look and see if I can find him. So I didn't have any really good ways except go online and punch in James A. Condon, ? And a lot of Condons came up, and I thought, well, if I have to spend a few nights and call 100 people, I will. The 6th person I called, okay, let me refer to my note over here. The 6th person I called, and I said, I could tell it was an elderly man from the way he sounded. I guess I sound that way now. But I said, did you fight in Germany? The man said, yes. Were you with the 28th Infantry Division? The man said, yes. Did you fight in the Hurkin Forest? Yes, I did. At that point, I knew I had the right man, and I had the correct James A. Condon. And I said, I'm Stanley Farrior, and Julian Farrior was my brother. And he said, I knew your brother. And so I picked his brains for everything I could about Julian. And he said, let's see. Oh, an important thing, he was with Julian just minutes before Julian was killed. Their unit was being replaced by another unit because they'd lost so many men. And so a higher officer was in there and getting all the goods together, and the battalion that was leaving, Julian was in that, and the battalion coming on was in there. And they were all the officers were talking, and Julian walked in the building, and Condon said, told Julian, he said, why don't you go ahead and get your men ready to roll, because we're going to be moving out of here very shortly. And they were actually leaving the Hurkin Forest that night. That's what's a heartbreaker. And so Julian said, okay. He went outside. About 10 minutes later, James Condon left the building, and he saw a sharp flash from the east, on the eastern side of Bostonac, Germany. And he knew what it was, knew a shell was coming. He immediately dove into a ditch, and just an instant later, the shell went off. And that's what killed Julian. Julian and his first sergeant, they were about 75 meters west of the church. And I've been over there, and I've stepped in that step. I know exactly where it was, within 30 or 40 feet. So, yeah, that's the picture now. There's the church behind. And it's about 70 meters or so. And we have another picture of that same site. I don't know if you have it or not, Alan, of how that street looked. Actually, it was taken on the 7th of February, a couple of days before Julian was killed. You might have it. No, I didn't see it there. Okay, it's probably don't. Whoops. Okay. Flash that one with the grave and with me leaning over. That was Julian's grave. That's at Andre Chappelle U.S. Military Cemetery. That day I was there. I had carved a little thing out of stone in my dental office, and I put on there. I wanted to take something over there and leave it, and I left it right very close to this grave marker, and it had October the 6th, whatever year it was, 2006, and I said, "I love you, Julian, Brother Stan," in the date. Okay. Well, let me just go over quickly. Somebody might be listening that's planning to do something like this and do some trying to dig up some ideas in the military from a military relative. But I found this condom, by going online, like I said, and using the phone. I discovered that there was a 28th Infantry Division Association in Erie, Pennsylvania. That was, I've met a lot of people in that, went to a couple of their anniversaries and talked with a couple of guys they didn't know Julian, but they were over there in the fight. And of course, there are very few living now. And I had some family history documents that helped. I had family relatives that helped. I did a lot of research in the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. I bought 6, 7, or 8 books about the fight over there in the swamp. I went to Europe and spent time in Wassenack, Germany, where Julian was killed, and battlefields all around there. I walked the spot where Julian was killed. I visited Andre Chappelle U.S. Military Cemetery, where Julian's buried, of course. And okay, now I have one more goal, and that is to organize all of my materials into one meaningful document and make copies for those interested, not write a book and try to, get it out to the public, but just for family and friends. And I may do it, I hope I will, or I may not. But thanks for this opportunity. I enjoy this a lot. I'll turn it back over to Joe.
Hi, everyone. So this is Alan Phillips Bell. I'm the Deputy Director at the Pender County Library. It seems that Joe has had some technical problems on his end, and so he has dropped out, and he's trying to get back in. So he may hopefully join us again in a moment.
Okay. Good job, Alan.
Thank you.
Stan, this is
Yeah.
Mike. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Let me ask you a couple of questions while we're waiting for Joe to come back.
Okay.
I think I know the answer, but I'd like other ones to know. Tell me, I understand that in the military cemeteries all across Europe, the French, the Belgians, the people in the villages surrounding the cemeteries have adopted the graves. And I understand there's a couple that adopted Julian's grave.
That's exactly right. And there's a little story there. I'll be glad to tell you.
Yes, please. I think
Okay.
it has to do with how you met Joe.
yes, the couple that adopted Julian's grave are in Belgium. They live about 30 miles. And anyway, his name is Ed Tyback, and his wife's name is Anita. And they're just so nice. And the people over there in Belgium, when I was over there, even though a lot of years have passed, they were extremely grateful, forever grateful for what we did in World War II, because they were just enslaved by the Germans. And if it hadn't been for us, I don't know what would have happened. But so what happened, Joe knew Ed Tyback, and he was talking to him about his book and about the theme of the book and so forth. And so Ed told Joe, well, that he knew me and that he was, he thought maybe my situation with Julian, that he might be interested in talking to me about being one of the main characters in his book. See, Joe has about a dozen soldiers. I think they were all killed. And some of them, and one thing in his book too, is that some of these, the families of some of these people have never found their sons or fathers or brothers. And worldwide, and I mean, World War II wide, there was I think like 70,000 that have never been found, but a lot of them were, on ships and went down, and of course they weren't found. But that's how Ed Tyback got Joe and I together.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. You have any other questions?
So I see there's an audience member who has a question for you, I believe.
Okay.
Let me see. And that, so BJ, I see you are unmuted now if you want to go ahead. If you're having trouble with your audio, BJ, you can type a question into the chat window and we can ask it that way. All right.
I see Sally has a question.
Yeah.
He would like to.
Oh, no, sorry. Did you unmute me?
Oh,
Okay.
yes. Okay. I didn't know that was you.
Yeah, that was me. Sorry, my computer froze, so I got onto a laptop and tried to log on to you. So,
Sorry.
so I'm on a laptop now, named BJ Quincy.
Oh.
Okay. Now let me see. We've got
Yeah, my computer just it had a latency problem.
Okay.
Hey, Alan.
Sorry about that.
Yes.
Can the folks on my screen up here, can they see, can they hear me speaking?
Yes.
Okay. I'm the great uncle of Julian Farrior III, and he's looking toward me. Hey, Julian. Yep. I can't hear him. But his father, of course, was, well, my brother was Julian Wade Farrior Sr., and then his wife was pregnant with this man's father when Julian went to sea.
Can you guys hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah. Hey.
Oh, great. Hey, Stan. Stan, it was lovely. Thanks per usual. Thanks for sharing that with everyone. It's hard to listen to, really. So
I know it is. I know it is. I tell you, after with me as a 8-year-old, not accepting his death, and then at 70, it just, I tell you, and I almost came to tears a little while ago in the talk, and and I might do that now.
Well, but thank you to you and Joe both for really,
Mhm.
you know, highlighting both him and the other people associated with sort of, you know, this battle and this period and everything going on. Really, you know, I haven't read the book yet, but I very much look forward to it. And,
Yeah.
you know, to say I'm thankful for his service and what he's done is obviously a dramatic understatement, but I'm very appreciative of you and Joe and everybody involved kind of unearthing it, sharing it, keeping his memory alive. So
Yeah, that's right.
know,
I'm very proud of this too, you know. And Joe has just been a great man to work with, and
Yeah.
couldn't be any nicer. And there is a significant part of his theme are these guys that have never been recovered from their death. And of course, our Julian was not one of those. You know, he knew exactly. His body was picked up the next morning, I think. But there are many that, especially in that particular area, that when we pulled out, I think a lot of them, they're in foxholes, and the artillery shells can cover your hole up and bury you, dead or alive, and then you're never found. So anyway, I know it's extra sad when you you know, when there's a doubt about, well, what really happened to my relative, you know, and it's extra bad. But it's war's hell, and it's just horrible when I think about young men from anywhere in the country just going through that. And we never get away from it, do we? You know, it's always somewhere in the world. Your family doing well?
yeah, everybody's doing great, Stan. They really are. Well, and I ordered Joe's book today, so I very much Stan has been gracious enough to share sort of his findings with me as they came along, and he's done a great job, Joe, obviously as you know, of collecting all this information. So I've gotten bits and pieces here, and I've read different books, obviously around this kind of period and area. But very appreciative of Joe kind of bringing it all together in one volume. So I look forward to reading that.
Yeah.
By the way, I mailed you a book. Has it come?
No, but now I have 2 copies.
Yeah, yeah, I mailed it a couple of days ago.
Great.
But you'll be getting it. And I put a note in the fly part of it, and I wrote a couple of pages of things.
Great. Well, thanks for doing that.
Joe,
were you going to say something?
Oh, I was going to say that I left off, but I was going to say that, you know, there is, writing the book and doing the research for the book, I really became angry at some point, because even though I am not a military person, just getting all of the information that I could about the behind the scenes politics that went on, and information about decisions about when to go to battle, getting all of that information in front of me and sitting down and using my civilian brain, I came up with a major flaw. And I think that Stan also agrees with me, because we had a conversation briefly about this. And if that flaw was addressed by the generals, if that flaw was only addressed by the generals, this 5-month-long battle, which was the Hurtgen Forest, and there were about at least 10 different infantry divisions that went into that forest,
Right.
the 28th Infantry being one of them.
Right.
If that flaw had been addressed in November of 1944, we would have saved thousands of lives, including lives that were lost in the Battle of the Bulge, which followed later. And I think that if you read it, in a sense, I don't want to give it away to you because you haven't read the book yet. And one of the things that I pride in is trying to build suspense. And so I'm not going to tell you what the flaw is, but I think that you will find out what the flaw is. You know, if Alan is around, he can flash a screen. He can flash a photo on the screen. I think what number is it? It's number 15. It's number 15.
Which picture is it that you want?
I think it's photo number 15. If you don't, that's fine.
Right here.
Yeah, this is a drawing by one of the engineers of that day. I think the day was November 3rd, the night of November 3rd and the night of November 4th. And that was a very, very critical 24-hour period for the 28th Division. And there, I'm not going to tell you what the flaw is, but if you look at this picture and you read the copy that goes along with this particular picture, I forget what figure, but if this was addressed, you know, we would have ended that battle with the 28th Division. You know, I don't think I am overstepping my boundaries because, you know, because there is a scene in this particular chapter, it's 8, 9, or 10, when the general of the 28th Infantry Division really sits down and thinks that he's Napoleon. He called him a little Napoleon because he has actually, you know, won a battle that nobody thought he could. And if only this problem was resolved, Coda would be a household name today, General Dutch Coda. General Norman Dutch Coda today would be a name that many people would be familiar with. He could probably even have run for president. I don't think I'm exaggerating, but he would have had that kind of thing. But the problem is that this particular flaw was not addressed. And as a result of it, we had people like Julian Farrior have to give up their lives. And like people that are the other main characters in the book had to die. And, you know, the legacy of the pain and suffering that they have left with their families, all of that could have been avoided, I think, if only this issue was addressed beforehand. Instead, what happened was there was so much politics involved among the generals, you know. The problem, the bad guys in this story is not so much the Germans, but it's the American generals. I think the American generals, an argument can be made, were the reason that so many American soldiers died or got wounded in that battle. And that's because of the competition that existed between the American generals amongst themselves and the top American general, Omar Bradley. The competition he had with the English leader, the leader of the English Allied troops. His name is Bernard Law Montgomery. And I think that all of this human foibles behind the scenes really created the chaos and the mess that resulted in the worst defeat the Americans suffered in Europe. And I think that if some of those issues can be discussed now, we might be able to come to some kind of catharsis or metamorphosis, but it really needs to be discussed on a much larger scale than inside of a military school in a classroom in Kansas City, where a bunch of military officers are learning how to avoid mistakes and how to be good generals in case we have a war in the near future or in the future at some point. And anyway, so I don't want to give it away, but I wanted to tell you that there's a lot of the details that Stan's brother Julian provided, and thanks to a lot of the very, very honest battlefield reports that I was able to include in the book, that you can come to an understanding of how we really screwed up this battle.
Well, Joe.
Yes.
Well, you know, on the 2nd of February, when they started the attack about 9 o'clock that morning, there was G
No,
Company.
2nd of November.
Yeah, 2nd of November. That's right. Julian's company was G Company, and it went down from Gometer, you know,
Gometer.
parallel with Wassenack on the left side, went down that northeastern slope at the end of the area, and the F Company went down on the right side, and they were just fully exposed to to the cannon fire down the valley and up the hill from Breckenridge and one other place, and they just got
The 2 R's,
slaughtered in those.
R&R.
Yeah, they were just in completely seen. And then with the other, and they were protecting the left flank from the main group that went up the Call Trail and on up into Comershite. And I never have been able to understand, you know, it was so narrow that even tanks fell off into the swamp. And there were other roads other roads led into Comershite. I just couldn't, I don't know why in the world they went through the woods to try to get there.
Yeah, there were a lot of mistakes made, and one mistake was the lack of foresight, the lack of pre-reconnaissance work on the part of the scouts. You know, they had 4 or 5 days in which they could have scouted out the area, and they would have known if they only did their due diligence that the Germans were on these 2 cliffs that were overlooking Wassenack, where your brother Julian was positioned, and he was lucky to sustain, to come out alive after 3 full days of bombarding, constant bombarding those foxholes. And they should have known that they were right there in the line of fire of the Germans, who were looking down at them as if they were looking from a balcony onto a stage.
Exactly right.
They should have known that, but they didn't do their homework.
Some officer back behind the lines drew circles around there, and they said, "This is where G Company, you go there. E Company, you go somewhere else." And F Company, and I just didn't think about it, but it was on that downhill, and they were just you know, where I was wondering any of them lived through that battle there, on the end of Wassenack, northeastern end.
Right.
Anyway, you
But
just
it's too late to rewrite history.
You can't rewrite history.
Can't rewrite history, right?
Mm-hmm. But you can try to avoid it from happening again, can't you?
Yeah, if we get into that kind of warfare. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any questions?
50 square miles in the Hurricane Forest. That's like 7 miles square. And I think there were 50,000 killed, wounded, or captured in 6 months fighting. 50,000. Hard to imagine. GIs.
Right, the casualty rate, if you want to compare casualty rates of Normandy, the Battle of the Bulge, and this particular battle, All Souls Day battle, the casualty rate in Normandy was 7%. So 7% of the soldiers were either killed or wounded.
I'm surprised.
When the Allies stormed the beaches.
Oh.
And in the Battle of the Bulge, the casualty rate was 15%. The casualty rate in All Souls Day battle was 64%. So it was unbelievable bloodshed and unnecessary bloodshed.
Yeah.
And that's what makes this particular battle so ignominious. You know, it was a defeat that could have been avoided.
You know, we avoided those.
But you know, it's so humiliating.
Those huge dams in the area they should have come into play, and they weren't. was whoever controlled those dams controlled the area. But
Right.
anyway, I think the Germans kept control of them. It's bad.
Yeah, the dams were the target of the U.S. Army, and they could easily have gotten to the dams
Yeah.
if only they had the town of Schmidt on the 4th of November. On the 4th of November, that's relatively early in the Battle of the Hürtgen Forest. If they were able to hold that town, and they could easily have done it if they had only addressed the flaw, which I won't really tell you much about. If they had addressed the flaw, the Americans could have held the town of Schmidt. And from the town of Schmidt, they could have controlled those dams. And once those dams were controlled, taken out of the hands of the Germans, the Americans basically had a free run all the way to Berlin, because right there was the industrial center of the German army. That's where all of the ammunition was made. That's where all of the ships carted out that steel and ammunition out to the rest of the German army. And the Americans could have stopped all of that right there and taken control of the European theater. By about November, by about December, by about Christmas of 1944.
Terrible.
And that's the sad tragedy. That's the tragedy of this particular battle. They were right there at the point of victory, and they snatched victory out of the jaws of defeat by ignoring something very simple. And Stan, you hit on it. You hit on the flaw a few minutes ago. And that's how this battle played out. If, a civilian like me, in retrospect, can sit back here and say, hey, we could have won that battle. What happened? One of these big shot generals who've won so many battles in Africa and in other parts of the world, why can't they think of this? And the answer is hubris. The answer was that their egos got in the way of clear thinking.
Well, General Hodges was, I think he was over, he was high. I think he was a 3-star general. Did you know he flunked out of West Point? He did. Flunked out. And I don't know.
Yeah, he flunked out of West because he couldn't handle the math there.
He was
he had a chip on his shoulder for the rest of his life because everybody thought of him as a kind of a stupid guy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's General Hodges.
Yeah.
And he went up against one of the smartest German generals, Walter Model.
Yeah.
And he was outsmarted at the battlefield by a well-seasoned German general.
Yeah,
General Hodges was one of the reasons that
he was
this
not
flaw was
smart at all. Not smart.
Yeah, he was in a competition with General George Patton, and Patton and him were rushing to get to the Rhine River, which was about 30 miles or so away from the scene of where we are now, the All Souls Day battle. It was 30 miles inland, and the both of them were in a race to get to that river, because that river controlled the industrial belt of the German army. And Patton writes a letter to his wife, and in the letter he reveals the competition between him and Hodges. I have it on there. If Alan, if anybody's interested, you can flash it on to the screen.
I went to the military graveyard when I was in Europe, where George Patton is buried. Can you hear me? Can you hear?
I think the letter is number 9, Alan. Number 9. Yep. That's a letter that Patton writes to his wife in November of 1944. We are in a horse race with Courtney Hodges. If he beats me across the Rhine, I shall be ashamed.
Oh, man.
That was the kind of side that got in the way of clear thinking. They were in a rush to get to the Rhine, and in their rush, they overlooked a few little rudimentary fundamentals that they should have taken care of before they rushed to the Rhine.
Right.
And the people that paid the price were the soldiers in this book and their families. And Julian paid the price.
Yeah. Right. Well, in
Not having been able to shoot down at the hill that Julian was at, because the war, the Germans would have been pushed back by then. Julian was attacked on the 9th of November. And by the 4th of November, basically the Americans should have taken this area, Wassenack, Komischeit, and Schmidt.
Mhm.
So Julian would have been saved. He wouldn't have been exposed to German gunfire at the time.
Right.
On
Mm.
of November 9th.
Yeah.
I mean, all of the information is in the book. You can sit down and spread it out and see and play, armchair general if you want. But there were so many things that could have been avoided to save these lives.
Stan, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I want to make sure that both you and Joe realize some comments that have been in the chat. Now, the couple that adopted Julian's grave, what were their names again?
Ed,
Yes.
oh gosh.
Ed
Tieback.
Ed has been listening tonight, and he's gone now. But he
Okay.
wrote you a note to both you, and he said, it is Ed here. It is very late now, and I must leave soon. But I heard Stanley say we are a family from Belgium, but we are Dutch. We live in the south of the
Oh, that's right.
Netherlands,
Yeah,
in
that's
the
right.
province of Limburg, and indeed about 30 miles from the Andre Chapelle American Cemetery. Good night, everyone. It is after 2 a.m. at night here. I must go. We wish you all the best. But he said a few other comments. Nice to see you, Stanley and Joe. And this maybe was from Anita, his wife.
Yeah. I knew.
Right.
And also to Ted. Ted has been with us. And let me see if Ted is still here. Ted Temper. I saw he is here too. Greetings from the Netherlands. And thanks again for the book, Joe, and for your kind words you have written to us in the book. So I want you to know that. And I thought it was worth reading out loud as well.
Oh, yeah. That's nice.
Thank you.
They're
Yeah,
nice.
Ed is from the Netherlands and not from Belgium. He was the man who put me in touch in an indirect way with Stan, because Ed is also someone who collects and methodical and neat about his notes, and he knew really quickly how I could get a hold of Stan.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, well, he and I write to each other fairly often, and, he and his wife go out and take pictures, take flowers to Julian's grave, and it's, it's really nice to know they're over there one morning, and 2 hours later, I've got the picture. It's nice. Good people, bound to be. Well, how did you get to know him?
I got a hold of Ed's phone number and email address by another character in the book. There is a soldier that died on, in Komischeit. His name is Sidney Weaver. His daughter, Peggy Weaver, lives in San Francisco now. She got married, and her married name is Robinette. And Peggy gave me the phone number of Ed and Anita Tieback in the Netherlands. I called them just because I call every person that I have in my Rolodex. And one thing led to another, and they told me that you have this tremendous story about Julian, and that I needed to talk to you.
This is what
My
Ed
initial
Tyback,
thought at the time was, why would I want to? I'm sorry.
that was Ed
Oh,
Tyback.
my initial thought was, go ahead, Stan,
Okay,
go ahead.
you're still speaking about Ed Tyback. And
Right, I'm still speaking about Ed Tyback. Yeah.
Okay.
But Ed is a very interesting person. He is so overwhelmed by the goodness of the Americans who liberated Europe from a tyrant, a dictator, that he is to this very day dedicated to trying to help families find their loved ones who died in Komenscheidt and Wassenack and in Schmidt.
Mhm.
Komenscheidt is where most of the missing the soldiers are still missing. And, there is in a part of the book a kind of way to figure out how to possibly locate where their loved ones were last seen. And usually from the finds that we have on record, the finds of the remains of soldiers, where they died and where they were buried were not very far. Sometimes it's just a few yards away. The German families returning to the villages didn't really have time to find a cemetery. The German soldiers were taken to a German cemetery, but the Americans had no place to go because the war was not fully ended yet. This was in April of 1944, and the war didn't really end till May and possibly the end of May before things started to normalize. And so they basically had to dig holes in the ground and put these soldiers in the ground. They with a lot of respect. And what happened was the soldiers that have been found since then, over the last 70 years or so, they have been found more or less in the same backyards and in the same areas where their units were. In this particular case, Company A of the 112th Regiment. And so I think that it's possible if you take today's Google map and if you take the battlefields, the maps that were created by the engineers back in 44, and those maps were professionally done, so that you could almost overlay those old maps onto the new maps, and give or take a few yards, you may on your own be able to locate where the remains of your soldier might be, your father, your brother, or your grandfather. And there is a way to do it. There are metal detectors, there are ground radar systems, ground GPSs that can find out where there is metal or where there is rusted material. And helmets and grenades are usually picked up by these detectors. And with the aid of some of these new technologies, it may be possible that, with cooperation with the families that live there now in Komenscheidt, that you could find, you don't have to wait for the government. You don't have to wait 70 years for the government to find your loved one.
That's good. Good.
You can go yourself now. I might be saying something that doesn't sit well with the US Army. There could be some political ramifications of this type of personal research, but I think that it can be done. And if you are really trying to bring closure to, the pain and suffering that you have, this might be one way to do it.
Mm-hmm. Did you ever read Ed Miller's book about the battle?
I did.
Had a lot of detail in it. It had, a dark and bloody ground. Yeah, I've got it.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, that's a good book. He was a military guy. I've talked to him before. And
Right.
did a good job. When I first got up found out about him, and I was talking to him on the phone, and in just a few days from that time, quite a while back, he was somebody was making a film over there in the area, in the Comerscheit and Schmidt and Bostonac, and I don't remember who it was, but they wanted him to come over and advise them and have a a speaking part in the film. It wasn't a Hollywood kind of a film. It was an informational thing. But that was when I first met him, probably 10, 12 years ago. Good while. I talked to him a few days ago, and I wanted to, I sent him a book too, one of your books.
Oh, you did? Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, his was more a broad view of the entire forest beginning in September of 1944, going all the way to February of 1945. It was a five-month long campaign, and he covers all of the details of the 10 infantry divisions that went through the Hürtgen Forest. But our book, your book and mine, Stan, focuses strictly on the 28th Division, which was a 1 week long or maybe 8 day long battle.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So we're able to get more into the weeds with our book than Ed Miller was able to get into the All Souls Day battle.
Mm-hmm.
But Ed definitely is an expert in this field. He's well recognized. He's used by documentarians, both in the US as well as in Germany. And there's another book, Follow Me and Die,
yeah, I've got that one
written
too.
by Curry.
Yeah.
And he writes a little bit more about the 28th Division. He was a professor at the military college that I was talking about, and he taught a course on this particular battle at one point. I think he's retired, and he might be living either in England or in Germany now. He's also written about this battle. So if you happen to want to read more about what happened over there, you can look at Ed Miller's book and Cecil Curry's book. And you can also.
Don't let me cut you off. Please continue, Joe.
Oh, and you can also go to the National Archives in Maryland. For Stan, I think it was a 10-hour drive from Burgaw, and if you find yourself a nice hotel, you can really get into all of the. You can get an honest view of what the generals were thinking. And one thing that struck me as I poured through those documents was General Coda's statement. And I think I have it in one of the General Coda's statement. I think he says, I can't remember which slide it is, but he says in an interview with William J. Fox, who was the reporter historian, collecting information about the battle. That's the one good thing about them. I mean, they recorded everything. They recorded action at the end of the day if the generals could, or the sergeants and the lieutenants could write something down amidst all of the bombs and the guns going off. And at the end of each battle, they would send this guy, William J. Fox, to the generals and interview them at great length. And the generals, I think, were very, very frank. They were not doing a PR job. And so if you read these interviews, and they're all printed out in paper form, typewritten at these libraries, you can get a pretty good idea of what was going through their minds at the time. And General Coda, on the 1st of November, when he was about ready to launch into this battle the very next day, he is approached by his superior, who is General Hodges. And General Hodges, in his diary, his war diary, writes that he thinks at that point, one day before this battle begins, that the 28th Infantry is raring to go. That's a direct quote. And he looks at Coda and says that. And Coda looks back at Hodges and gives him the answer that he wants. He nods and tries to pretend to be confident. But then that's November 2nd, 1944. But in an interview on December 13th, 1944, just about 5 weeks later, after he's had a chance to stand back and take stock of everything, he says, in an interview with William J. Fox, he said, at that time, I remember thinking that we had a gambler's chance of success, of winning this battle. And so, you know, if you can go and look at, if you really want to get into the weeds of this story, you can go and look at all of the interviews and the battlefield reports that are now archived in the College Park National Library.
You know, it's disgusting when, you know, a general, one-star general, tells his boss the opposite of how he really feels. That's just disgusting.
Yeah, it was. There was a lot of pressure that Coda felt in order to regain his name, because Coda at the time went from being a hero to being almost fired as a general, because he had screwed up a battle previous to that, and as a result of him losing that battle and being pulled from the front line by his superiors because he was losing too many men. He lost, I mean, the division at that time lost something like 1,500 men in just 2 days. And so because of that bloodshed wrath, he was pulled from the front line, and the Americans stopped fighting the Germans at that point, which was only about 20 miles away from the Hürtgen Forest and from Komerscheid. And because of that, there was all kinds of pressure that Coda felt to please his superiors so that he could regain that, get back on that pedestal that he had acquired as a result of his daring do in Normandy Beach. At Normandy Beach, he was a hero. He was an old guy. He was in his 50s, and he was telling younger guys in their 20s and in their teens how to do stuff. And he was faster than all of them. And he went down. He was talked about among the military top brass as, you know, the hero, the man of 1944. He was going to be the soldier of 1944. He was waiting for that knighting, and Coda was a very proud man. So when he when he was at this battle, he was really trying to regain his name. And there was a small moment of glory for him, you know, on the evening of December 3rd, when the 112th Regiment went to Schmidt, and they took hold of Schmidt. There were no Germans there. They just actually, they arrested all of the Germans, put them in cellars. The Germans immediately raised their hands and surrendered, and the Americans were, you know, king of that hill. Schmidt was on a hill, and at that point, all of these congratulatory messages came into Coda by telegram from the other generals that were following this battle. And he said at that point in his memoirs, he said he felt like a little Napoleon. But that quickly dissipated the next day when the Germans, realizing that the Americans were completely unprepared because of this flaw. Because of this flaw again, they were completely unprepared. Walter Moltke said, he said, there was one army, which is basically the 28th Infantry Division, that was attacking on the side of the Americans, that was attacking this area. And Modell knew that he had the Americans with their backs against the wall. And so he commissioned 3 German armies. And at that point, it was 3 armies against 1, and there was no match. It was no match for the Germans. The Americans were no match for the Germans.
I think that might have been the major flaw,
And
was
they just
lack
ran
of,
right through
lack of
those
armor.
3 towns and took them back again. Yes, they had tanks. They had 16 tanks coming down on an army that had 1 tank left.
Yeah.
The Americans had 1 tank because 2 were disabled. And they had 16 German tanks coming right down a hill, just blasting away at everybody, at everything that moved in a foxhole.
I think that was.
And
is
we
that
have
your-
a first. Go
Is
ahead.
that your main flaw you refer to? Oh,
Well, if you really press me, I will give away the secret, but because I know you've read it, Stan, and I think you already hit on it. It had to do with that path, that narrow path called the Call Trail.
oh yeah.
That narrow path called the Call
Exactly.
Trail was the
Right.
major flaw.
Oh yeah.
Okay, they
Yeah,
didn't do
we
their
should have
homework.
gone in from the western side of Comershite. There was a road there. I've seen it on maps. Pretty decent road. We could have driven right in there instead of going round and round. I mean, I've walked on that Call Trail all the way up, and it's just a tiny little path. Not big at all.
But 9 feet wide, and an American Sherman, which was smaller than the German tank, was 9 feet wide. But the problem was that the sides were corroding from the rain that pelted the place for a whole month. And so the side was just kind of eroding away, slipping down that
Mm-hmm.
big ravine. And the tanks had a hard time negotiating their 9-foot machines on a road that in some places was 6 feet or 7 feet. And so a lot of the tracks were overflowing the trail. And one of them, as you pointed out, slid down the side.
Yeah.
And if that trail was addressed, that trail problem was addressed, and all they needed was about 12 hours or 24 hours delay. If they had the engineers working on that trail, they would have been able to send down 18 Sherman tanks to Comershite and taken on the Germans. The Germans would have continued to flee backwards to the interior, all the way to the
Right.
dams.
That's right.
The Americans had the advantage of being on top of the hill and the Germans being at the bottom of the hill. That was a huge advantage. They would have been able to drive them back all the way to the dams, taken the dams, and from there they could have
Yeah.
controlled the industrial belt.
Going up that trail like they did was the dumbest thing that we did.
Right.
Terrible. Well, getting sleepy. Um, Are you home, Joe? Joe?
Yeah, I'm my study.
Mm-hmm.
That's why I don't have a mask on. But everywhere else I wear masks.
Yeah,
To
I've
the
got
gym,
mine in my
I
pocket.
don't go to the gym anymore.
Hey, I've got mine in my pocket. You reckon it'll help me? Hey, there's Darren Castine, my granddaughter. Right there. Hey, Darren.
And Stan, there are others that you cannot see. If there's a little arrow up in the right-hand corner of your screen.
Yeah.
But you will see others that are attending and some family members as well. I believe that must be your son, Mac, perhaps.
Oh, really?
Kristen, well, it's Mac. It doesn't have last name, but I wonder if it's Mac Farrior.
Well, how do I access that? Not
Kristen, let me see. I think David is in. and other people, good people you know. But this has been a wonderful couple hours, and I really appreciate you both so much for sharing. And I want to say thank you to Alan Phillips Bell for his part in arranging all this technology for us and
Good
his
job.
advice. Yes, very good job. And just want to thank everyone who's attended. We have a good maybe 24 people who are still with us after 2 hours.
Wow.
And I think that we've had a number of people, that had to leave. And so, Joe, thank you again. It's been a real privilege to have you.
It's been a pleasure.
And Stan, your contributions and your stories, thank you so much. We are recording this, and we will have it on our website. Alan, I believe I suppose it would be under events.
We'll be posting it to our to our YouTube channel. And so you'll be able to view it there. And I'm sure we'll post it to Facebook once we have it up on YouTube.
Great.
Good. Well, I've really enjoyed it, Mike, and I'm just glad we did it, and I appreciate all that you've did. You've done a lot of work down here to get all this, pull it all together, you and Alan.
Well, thank you very much.
And I appreciate it a lot.
Yeah, Mike, you and Alan should be really complimented because you were able to deal with the technology, send the links out. I know that I'm not going to name them, but I know that other libraries are still struggling with that technology, and I'm working with them in the meantime. But you were able to do it really quickly. I was very impressed by how easy the links worked. Sometimes the links do not work that well, but the freeze is really the freeze that I suffered today was really my computer being overloaded, and it's not your problem at all. But
Right.
you guys with the links and with the Zoom and with the chat ability and to send out notices to your patrons was really incredible, and you should be complimented for it.
Well, that's due to Alan, I promise you. So, good night, everyone. And I hate to say good night, but it's time. And I would be happy to arrange a meeting with you and some others sometime, if you'd like
Absolutely.
to.
Let me know.
Yes.
Yes.
Very good. So good night, everyone.
Okay. Good night.
Thank you for listening, and it's a
Good
pleasure
night,
meeting all of
Bud.
you. Bye.
I'll be talking to you.
Bye, Stan.
Bye-bye.
Have a good evening.
Thank you. You
Bye.
too. Enjoyed it a lot. Did a great job.